Great, it looks like we're all assembled. Hello and welcome to the Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics second annual lunchtime lecture series entitled Critical Discussions, Multi-Stakeholder Perspectives on the Ethics of Pediatric Gene Therapy Research. Today, day one of the series, we will be talking about pediatric gene therapy research in the context of uncertain risk-benefit. My name is Katherine Beaverson. I am a genetic counselor by training. I lead patient advocacy for Pfizer's Rare Disease Research Unit, and I am a member of PGTME. Annually, PGTME hosts a series of multi-stakeholder discussions on current topics related to the ethics of pediatric gene therapy research. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics of NYU Grossman School of Medicine. You can learn more about PGTME on our website, the link to which will be dropped in the chat, and you can sign up for our free quarterly newsletter to stay abreast of our work. If you are unable to attend a Critical Discussions Lunchtime Lecture Series event in real time, we will be posting captioned recordings on YouTube once the series has concluded, and we will share the link with all registrants. You can check out last year's talks by looking for PGTME on YouTube. Today's event will feature brief introductions by our 4 panelists, followed by a moderated discussion. We've also allowed 40 minutes for audience Q&A at the end, so throughout the panel, we encourage you to submit your questions through the Q&A feature. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our panelists to introduce themselves and their work. In addition, I invite them to contextualize their touch points to pediatric gene therapy research and the stakeholders involved in their work. Adam, would you kindly start us off?
I will. Thank you very much, and thanks to NYU and to the Institute for the kind invitation. My name is Adam Hartman. I am a physician. I'm a program director in the Division of Clinical Research at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, which is one of the institutes at NIH. I've been involved a lot in the discussions of gene therapy in various roles that I play at NIH, and I'm also the point of contact for some of the NINDS ethics notices. I'm also a practicing child neurologist and specialize in epilepsy, so I'm not prescribing gene therapy yet, but that day is probably coming sooner than we think. I'm also one of the members of the Consortium Assembly for the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, and I led a project there on ELSI, ethical, legal, social implications in rare diseases, which was published just last year. It's great to be here. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks, Adam. Cláudia.
Thank you. Honored to be a part of this group today. Earlier in my career, I was president of a company that developed therapies for rare diseases. Although those are not gene therapy in approach, it did give me a good understanding of the patient experience and priorities. But the more relevant point of contact now is probably that I'm the owner and executive chair of a company called VOZ Advisors. We are focused exclusively on advising biopharmaceutical companies on how to insert the patient perspective in all areas of patient advocacy and patient engagement. In that capacity, we advise a quite considerable number of gene therapy companies, and a large portion of those are focused in gene therapy. So that's my connection. Thanks again.
Thanks, Cláudia. Ryan.
Katherine, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Ryan Fischer. I'm Chief Advocacy Officer at Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. We're the leading organization in the fight to end Duchenne muscular dystrophy. My role at the organization is to oversee our major pillars of advocacy care research and co-lead our Duchenne patient registry called the Duchenne Registry. I also lead our patient-focused drug development initiatives under PPMD, including a series of patient preference studies. So we were one of the early adopters to investing in patient preference research, essentially quantifying the patient voice and producing now 14 publications to date, which includes, and is relevant today, a study on gene therapy. And I was pleased to work with Katherine on that study. That's my disclosure for the panel. So I'm excited to have this timely discussion, as Duchenne is currently, gene therapy studies are currently underway and more to come. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And last but certainly not least, Safiyya.
Thanks, Katherine, and good afternoon. I appreciate the invitation to join you all here today. My name is Sophie Gassman, and I lead our policy and public affairs for gene therapy at Pfizer. And in my role, I work with our global stakeholder community that includes patient organizations, NGOs, government, to help shape the policy environment ahead of launch of our gene therapy portfolio. So we at Pfizer believe that there should be a strong healthcare infrastructure in place ahead of launch of our therapies to ensure our patients get access to the care and treatment they need. And so we often engage to help shape the policy environment quite early on, sometimes 4 or 5 years in advance. And as you can imagine, in the world of gene therapy, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of limited awareness around what these technologies are. So there's some upfront education that our teams do before we can actually engage in the policy shaping. So we're often operating in an environment where we have very limited information. We get a lot of questions from our stakeholder community around issues such as, are these really one and done treatments? How long will they last? Questions on durability, questions on safety. And we oftentimes just don't have all the answers. And so to address some of these challenges related to uncertainty, we at Pfizer have employed a number of strategies, and I'm pleased to join this panel today to share our experience and really appreciate the opportunity to join my colleagues in this dialogue.
Thanks so much, Safiyya. Throughout this week's Lunchtime Lecture Series, we will explore the concept of uncertainty and how it shapes multi-stakeholder perspectives on the ethics of pediatric gene therapy research. In today's discussion, we will focus on the following question. How do we, and the we spans a number of communities, not merely industry or clinicians or the FDA, but how do we communicate uncertainty about gene therapy research, and especially its benefit risk calculus to and with patients and surrogate decision makers? What are we saying about gene therapy? Who are we saying it to? Why are we saying it? How is it being received? And how do we know how it is being received? Do we have clarity on known unknowns and recognizing unknown unknowns regarding the risks and benefits of gene therapy as an emerging investigational treatment? And are we able to communicate them to enable decision-making by children, their adult surrogate decision makers, and families seeking to enroll a child in gene therapy for rare diseases? So my first question in this moderated discussion is to Ryan. So as the panelist most directly connected to the patient community, what are the uncertainties about gene therapy research that are most concerning to the child and the adult patients and their families that you seek to support?
Sure, thank you, Katherine. There's a whole range of uncertainties, and some of these cut across not only Duchenne gene therapies, but other conditions, and uncertainties around the durability of these one-time therapies. And whether or not redosing will be in the future for those who may have a limited, time-limited benefit. The studies to date, prior to our human clinical trials, of course, were all in animal models. So there are inherent uncertainties around how that translates to humans, and that's why we do clinical testing. But I think these are difficult decisions that families have to make, faced with the inevitable progression of Duchenne. Parents are weighing all of these elements of potential benefit, uncertainty, the potential risks associated with gene therapy. And for those who were the first patients that were being dosed in these trials, there was such high levels of uncertainty, even around risk. And what could happen. And I think these are just hard things to grapple with, particularly when the first cohorts are younger children who families had just recently received that diagnosis of Duchenne, and now they're grappling with a decision for a therapy that may be a one-time treatment that could not be re-administered later on. So I think there's a whole host of uncertainties that people have to deal with, and how we communicate about those uncertainties is key.
And so just to follow up, you've outlined very nicely some of these uncertainties that, are really these unknowns right now. Now, the mission of your organization and many other advocacy groups, right, is to educate and empower and support these families as they're thinking about their participation. So, given and our other panelists will talk more about kind of methods of communication, but how does these uncertainties impact your ability to do to serve your community across the education, empowerment, and support?
I think it's constantly evolving. As new knowledge is learned, communicating what's being learned from early studies. First, providing them with a baseline understanding of what we know at this moment about gene therapy. We want patients and families to make the most informed decisions as possible. But I think we recognize that, for lack of a better phrase, the story they're being told, even by their clinician, may vary about what could be expected in terms of benefits, what we may know about risks. I think it's difficult to hear the words, "we just don't know" right now for a therapy that you can't wash out of at the end of the day. So what we try to do is provide as much education and guidance. We have certified genetic counselors on staff that talk to patients about clinical trials, not necessarily recommending one or over the other, but whether or not they qualify. We had to do a lot of education around neutralizing antibodies. There's the uncertainty factor around that. I should have mentioned that earlier, because some parents don't know whether or not their son would qualify at all if they were positive for those antibodies, and would not even get past screening. And there's not a commercial test to tell them that. So they're living with uncertainty, even whether or not they'll be able to get into a trial. So it's a ton of education. You have to find different ways to communicate because people learn in different ways.
So I think you referenced something very important, and I think key to this conversation is that it's an evolving, right, dialogue. And so I'm gonna, ask a question to Cláudia, right? Given the uncertainties that Ryan just, nicely teed up, when we think about industry sponsors, how can industry sponsors best convey uncertainty around durability, around safety and efficacy or potential efficacy of investigational gene therapy products? Maybe touch upon, kind of not only the how, but to what groups do sponsors need to convey the information and why? And then do all the groups get the same information? And if not, why? What complications may that cause? So I know that's many questions in one, but Cláudia.
Sure, I'll try to tackle them. I'm not sure I remember the first one, but I'll try to tackle them as closely in order as I can. I think the first important step is for a sponsor to understand its audience. We see a difference in different therapeutic areas. So I think doing a thorough assessment of the reality of the therapeutic area, what the concerns are. I very much appreciate what Ryan said, the living with uncertainty, to the degree of anxiety that those families and patients are living with. Really having your finger on the pulse of that community is important. Understanding their journey from diagnosis to where they are today, what are the key points, of transformation in that process. And I think developing a strategy for communicating with patients. And if you've done this work, now you have a really good sense of the who. and how to touch not only the patients who are most engaged maybe with a patient group, but really looking at the broadest possible audience that you can connect with. I think in terms of the challenges for sponsors, in my opinion is I think they tend to oversimplify the process regardless of their appreciation of the importance of it. So clients come to us and they absolutely understand this is essential. But when we talk about the work that is required to really do it well, there is certainly a bit of a shock that's saying, wow, that's a lot, that's very deep. And the reason it's very deep is because this explanation is very difficult, very much what Ryan said before. You have to start at the science, you have to walk them through all the relevant steps. And the sponsors are not usually fluent in doing that from a patient-friendly perspective. There's a great misconception that what patient-friendly is just simple language. That's just not true. You really need to co-develop those materials with patient groups so they really are patient-friendly from the perspective of understanding how they'll be read. The potential complications in terms of these miscommunications can be misinterpretation of the process of informed consent. It can be very misinformed. I actually have experience personally with a friend whose child participated on a trial. And I asked her, how did she make this decision? You know, because there were actually options in that therapeutic area. And she said, this was the first available. And she said that, you know, she can always try another one later, which is likely not to be true. She said that the consent process was very thorough and she understood everything, but I think she really missed some of the big considerations there, as her key consideration was urgency. She needed to get it done immediately. So I think understanding how we will be perceived is probably the greatest concern for sponsors, and really having an assessment that include patients and patient groups. Did I get to all your questions? Do you want me to elaborate on anything?
You did. I am going to, just tease out some additional points in that, you nicely highlighted kind of the concerns that companies may have in communicating with patients, early on and around gene therapy. And that was a nice explanation of really focusing on the science and understanding where patient communities are with that. But there are other stakeholders that companies are communicating with and to. And could you speak a little bit to those communications? Why are they happening, right? And what are some concerns when there may be conflicting messages that patient communities are hearing out of some of those other communications? So you can just walk us through some other stakeholder communications?
Sure. There are researchers and clinicians involved that, given their enthusiasm for something, could communicate it in a more hopeful way than they really should consider. But I think the biggest tension that comes to mind is that companies very much cater their communications to the investor community. Whether you are a public company or you are a private company, investors are a big part of your life. And there are specific guidelines, especially for public companies, in terms of what gets communicated, when it gets communicated, and how it gets communicated. So you don't have anymore this one size fits all communication. I'm sorry, you don't have anymore the luxury of going to patient meetings and talking to patients without investors actually being in that audience, or talking to investors, say it in an earnings call, without patients listening along. So I think that understanding that patients tend to, in my experience, listen most to the opportunity, the benefit that they might gather. Investors tend to be skeptical and focus on the risks. So companies are trying to strike a balance between very different audiences. And I think the best approach, companies come to us all the time, very conflicted about this, and they advise us, this is not a project. We just tell them right away. The best approach is to strike a balance in the middle where you speak about both, and you're thorough about both. and get a reputation with both sides that you are a straight shooter, that you communicate openly and truthfully. But it's also important with the patient community to explain to them why these disclosures happen in a certain schedule and why it might be different from different companies that they're working with. Because this comes to the definition of what's material for a company. So what's material for a tiny biotech may be very different than what's material for a large pharmaceutical company. And sometimes patient groups feel, well, they did this, why didn't you do that? And it can be because they really don't have the opportunity to do that, but they never took the time to explain that. So that's probably, I think, the hardest conflict, having patients not learn about data from a press release. If you do need to have a press release because it is material, then having accompanying materials that get promptly into the patient community and have them understand why the communication is in this path. So those are the thoughts on the different audiences.
Thanks, Cláudia. So, this next question is to Adam, right? I think both Ryan and Cláudia have, referenced how important, and frankly, the kind of the arbiter of a lot of these conversations are the clinicians and researchers who are directly engaged with families and children in the conversations around investigational gene therapy products. So, in your role as a clinician and a researcher, what unknowns are families and their physician researchers most grappling with, and are these the ones that seem the most essential for them to be focusing on?
Thanks for the question, Katherine. So I think that both Ryan and Cláudia have started to paint a very complicated picture here, and I think all I'm going to do is make it even more complicated. So, there's the clinician versus the researcher role. And so if you're serving as the clinician, then typically an IRB doesn't want you serving as the PI, the principal investigator of that particular study. There should be some level of detachment there for a variety of reasons, mostly because of the conflict of interest. So that needs to be addressed. That's actually uncertainty too. Who's my clinician? Who's actually, so we'll start there. There, you made reference to the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns. And so, as you think about a study design, both need to be built in. And those uncertainties, speaking as a clinician, you wonder about the protein, you wonder about the vector, you wonder about things like post-translational processing, how the gene's going to be expressed, how sensitively it can be scaled on or off if it needs to be. There's the underlying biology that we learn about as time goes on. We think about the known unknowns. So what that means is we're basically building on incremental knowledge. And so this is where we saw a signal in preclinical studies in an animal study or in an early toxicity study. So an example would be a side effect where we know that that's a risk, but we don't know whether your child or your family member will be one of the people who experiences that side effect. There's also the unknown unknowns. These are, they may come out of the blue. We really don't know what, when they're going to happen or how severe the side effects are going to be. And so if it's a research study, it needs to be structured in a way that it can be monitored and detected in a timely fashion. So there are both short-term uncertainties and long-term uncertainties, and these may relate to host factors, so to speak. So the person who's getting the treatment, we don't know, we've touched on some of the immunology a little bit with the antibodies, but it also is about the gene therapy itself. We talk about impacts on growth and development. If someone's going to receive treatment, we'd like to make sure that they're going to have a healthful life as well as it can be structured, and also a good quality of life. It's not just enough to survive. You actually have to enjoy life as it goes along. For researchers and funders, there are also uncertainties about regulatory requirements. And sometimes you end up saying to a family, we don't know what the regulators are going to say about this. And so we're going to be presenting something. And sometimes that changes, the science changes, and so regulatory requirements might change. We also don't know what's going to happen. This happened a lot when we were talking about spinal muscular atrophy. We had no idea what the payers were going to do. And we also don't know about other commercial interests or capacities to see the trial through. Sometimes companies might need to go through merger acquisition in order to be able to better handle the logistics of a study. So in terms of how we address that, I think the first thing, because this is all pretty overwhelming. So usually where I start with any kind of a discussion about risk and benefit with any treatment that I'll be prescribing, whatever it is first figuring out where the family and the patient are, the potential study participant, finding out what their understanding is and knowing what fears they have. So knowing what they know, and then if there's some big, hairy fear that they have, I like to put that on the table right away, because a lot of times that's something that can be addressed pretty straight out. And also introducing in a way that can be understood by everybody, and making sure that we have a common understanding when we use a certain term, that it's understood that way by everybody involved. Sometimes that means having someone, what I'll say to the kids in my clinic is, your friend asks you what you were doing here in the doctor's office today. What are you going to tell them? How are you going to explain this to them? And that's a way, if they're capable of doing that, that's one way to sort of get some sort of a sense of where they are. Because if we don't scale our discussion of the uncertainty to where the child family participants are, then we've kind of, missed the mark.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, this idea of known unknowns and it gets quite, it's very hard to speculate, but we need the information, and as all the panelists have kind of said to this point, it's an evolving landscape of information that will get people to decision making. Safiyya, I think you're kind of the stakeholder that you're most engaging with, right, is probably the most off the radar for a lot of our attendees, but a very, very important one, that being policymakers and payers. So in your role of engaging with policymakers and payers, what are some of the challenges and maybe even best practices available to us in communicating uncertainty to these stakeholders?
Sure. So I think similar to the patient community, there's still a number of questions amongst policymakers and payers around what these technologies are. And so as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of upfront education that we have to do around the technology itself. So we do this in a number of ways. We do one-to-one discussions, leave behind legislative briefings, lunch-and-learns. We work closely with our advocacy community to help with these broader educational efforts. Now, we get a number of follow-up questions when we do these initiatives from our policymaker and payer community, specifically around durability, or how long these treatments will last. And I think this is really where communicating around terminology, and I think something that Ryan mentioned, is important. I think when we think about gene therapy, you probably have all heard the term cure or one and done therapies kind of floating around there. And the reality is that we won't have this data at launch. We won't have 30 to 40 years of data at launch. So we don't know that this will be the case for all gene therapies. And so at Pfizer, when we talk about terminology, we talk about gene therapies as being transformational. We understand that they have the potential to transform the quality of life of patients, and we want to ensure we're managing expectations and also appropriately communicating around what these therapies are. In terms of best practices, I think one example would be something that we did earlier this year. With the new members of administration coming on board, we shared a welcome pack, which was educational materials around the science behind gene therapy, the manufacturing process, with members of the Rare Disease Caucus. And we've also been working very closely with our advocacy organizations, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, as well as the Institute for Gene Therapies, to help support some of these broader educational efforts. A second challenge that comes from the policymaker payer community is really around awareness on the disease itself, and what the impact these potential therapies can have on quality of life for patients. So as you can imagine, this type of data is really important, especially for payers as they're making decisions around reimbursement. But from a rare disease perspective, developing this evidence is really challenging, just given the small patient populations, lack of standard of care, and honestly, just the lack of data that's available out there. And so we have to find new and innovative ways to develop this evidence and to also communicate around what that quality of life impact is. And there's some really great initiatives out there that are doing this. One that comes to mind is Project Hercules. Project Hercules is a multi-stakeholder collaboration that's being led by Duchenne UK, and Pfizer is a partner in this, to develop the evidence and tools to support discussions around impact on quality of life for reimbursement considerations. And they've been very successful. Just recently, they came out with a new metric around quality of life, and this will help payers to assess therapies based on metrics that are important to the patient community. So metrics we may not take into consideration from a reimbursement perspective, such as impact on mental health, impact on society. So these are just a couple of challenges that we're facing as we engage with policymakers and payers, and some examples of best practices or strategies that we're employing to help address these uncertainties.
That's great. That's great, Safiyya. And it's just a perfect lead in into kind of the next kind of point in our conversation, which is kind of switching to those tools and strategies that we might consider employing to reduce uncertainty or to better communicate uncertainty. And you referenced, you know, in the conversations that you're having, how, you know, kind of the evolving data landscape is driving those continued conversations. And I'd love to switch to Ryan. When we think about tools and strategies, you referenced very early on some of the patient preference research that you've done in the community. And, you know, kind of, can you elaborate a little bit more on that initiative, what it was and why it was so important, but then maybe reference some other ways and other things that PPMD has done to communicate about issues involving uncertainty. Because I think the shared goal is we want to certainly avoid false certainty, but to, you know, continue to provide, to help by providing available information.
Yeah, I mean, I think when, you know, as gene therapies were coming online before human clinical testing was to begin, we really had a lot of questions over what did the community understand about this new emerging technology. I mean, there was a portion of our community that had been following it for over a decade from the early science. They sort of joined the church early, right? They believed in it when they first saw the first mouse or animal study, but others were newly diagnosed. So, you know, we've done the typical, you know, webinars, educational videos, conference panels, et cetera. But we felt that this was an area ripe for patient preference research to understand how patients think and feel about these emerging gene therapies. And we did a project with the Precompetitive consortium of 2 companies, including Pfizer. Katherine was involved in that, as well as Solid Biosciences, to first understand sort of this, you know, what is the general understanding of gene therapy as it stands right now, before kids were going to be tested. And we crafted a vignette using our clinical and research experts. And we asked them, how would you describe gene therapy right now to a patient who's asking about a clinical trial? And we used that as the basis of our preference study for them to then sort of make choices on whether or not they'd be willing to take certain risks in exchange for certain benefit. It gave us a lot of insight. And one of those insights is there's a portion of the community that would accept extremely high levels of risk for the benefit or potential benefit presented to them. We, off that study, were able to talk to companies about the informed consent process, because I think so much comes down to the doctor-patient relationship and that shared decision-making construct that exists. So when we've done surveying around how people make decisions around healthcare of our community, the majority put a lot of that onto the opinion of their doctor. So they prefer to make the final decision after seriously considering their doctor's opinion. That's a large portion that make up our patient population. And then the other large portion is they prefer the doctor and the patient share responsibility in deciding which treatment. So those 2 pieces, rather than I just make it on myself after doing the research, or I leave it all to my doctor. So lower percentages on those other ranges, which means that conversation that happens within that office matters so much. So now we're looking at how do we understand what the clinicians are telling their patients about the uncertainties around gene therapy? And is there variability from clinician to clinician on the story, for lack of a better phrase, of what they're telling to the patient? Because I think this is going to give us greater insight into how patients are ultimately making choices.
So thank you for that overview. And I think, some of the other activities that PPND has been, just tremendous at, right? With the patient preference study that you mentioned, that that was a multi-stakeholder, group that came together that said this was really important to understand baseline thinking and trade-offs, right? And PPMD certainly provides multiple multi-stakeholder forums, right? As when we think about the Duchenne Drug Development Roundtable, when we think about the kind of updating guidance documents, I think the conversations where you're kind of setting the knowledge for some of the companies and some of the academics, right, is really also shaping the communication needs for patients, right, but also providing companies and other stakeholders with those tools for what we hope would be a consistent yet evolving conversation.
Yeah, I would hope that we can continue to do this work in the pre-competitive space where companies can get together, share learnings. We've been talking about the sort of testing for neutralizing antibodies, and that at the moment, the uncertainty around whether or not a child could qualify, patients are going out and getting commercial tests done. That doesn't necessarily translate to the test that would have to be given for specific gene therapy, but they're doing it because it's that uncertainty that is bothering them for making, it prevents them from making decisions about other trials, whether or not they may be in or out. So we've been pushing for some sort of central lab or some other way for companies to work together in the pre-competitive space. And on the guidance effort, from what we've learned to date in gene therapy, what we're trying to do is provide a roadmap, albeit these are early days, and I know we don't love that term, but let's take what we've learned to date and try to do it better moving forward. And that's done in a pre-competitive way as well.
I remember very early on, your organization was quite adamant about setting some language. Do not reference a cure.
Yes. Yeah, I think cure is a big word.
Yes. Yes.
And I think even, and this was brought up in the comments, and I'm sorry I'm taking up too much of the conversation, but this was a comment was submitted even about the term gene therapy, that it has therapy in the title. And I think it invokes in someone, this is my answer, and this is going to be exactly what I need right now. And for many of the patients, it's everything they want and nothing they can have. And it's really hard emotionally on most families.
Yes, and given that terminology, and I think you've addressed one of the questions in the Q&A about the language of gene therapy. I think folks listening today may appreciate that now it's all that much more important to always contextualize it with investigational and exactly where are we when we're using that language, right? Adam, again, that physician and that researcher, such an important role. Setting the language. Ryan did a nice job of, teeing up some tools, referencing some of the tools his organization uses for their conversations. What can physicians and researchers be doing, and what frameworks can they be providing as tools for adult decision makers and child participants in these trials?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the work that Ryan and his group are doing is fantastic, and I think that it has to be matched from every angle, right? It can't just be one group that's attempting to do this. And so, I've already talked a little bit about the potential conflict between physician and care provider, I should say, and the investigator. There are a few things that I think potentially could be helpful, and borrowing this from other contexts, one is having a neutral third party, or at least a friend, to be there during some of these discussions. I think all of us have been a patient at one point or another in our lives, and we all hear what we want to hear. Physicians are patients too. We're actually terrible patients. So we hear what we want to hear. I think that having a neutral third party there can actually help at least take in some of the information. And also the expectation is that you're not going to get everything done. I mean, when I talk about a big treatment that we're going to undertake, if I'm recommending someone for surgery or something like that, it's going to be multiple conversations. You can't just do this all, why don't you come in, we'll talk for 10 minutes and then you're good to go. You got your gene therapy, your cure, and you're set. Bye. My God, that's like absolutely 180 degrees from where I think things need to be. So it needs to be an open dialogue, and it has to be a non-judgmental dialogue as well. A lot of my families are self-administering treatments that are not approved by FDA. And we have to understand that, people want to be better off than they are now, and they're going to do what they think they need to do. You have to respect that. There's that individuality element that has to be respected by everybody all around. So a conversation like, if you're going to have additional questions, let's come back and revisit this. Making sure this is, it's not good to have these appointments first thing at the beginning of a clinic schedule. So you don't want to make this your 9 o'clock or your 1 o'clock appointment. These are the end of the day appointments, because you want to make sure that you have the time to be able to have these discussions. And if it's multiple discussions, then it's multiple discussions. What we're asking patients and families to do in the name of research is a pretty big ask. And at the very least, we can listen to what their questions are and try to, sort of help, because we're navigating through it too. I think, people talk about conversation tools, a list of questions that you might want to walk in asking. Those can be useful. Sometimes there are things that I don't think about that come up in those discussions. Sometimes they don't apply, but sometimes they do. Another thing is assessing the family dynamics and figuring out how. Sometimes you need to figure out who the decision makers are. We all make assumptions about that. Sometimes it's the quiet uncle who's sitting in the back of the room, not saying a word the whole time. And at the end, everybody looks at the uncle and says, what do you think? So you have to understand those dynamics. I think it's also important to address the impact on the family. And some of these are like day-to-day logistics too. Like, so we're going to be coming in, how often, for what kinds of tests, we're driving in from out of town, or we need a place to stay, things like that. So it's not only is it the right thing to do, but it also, I hope, also gives the impression that the team is thinking about, the care providers are thinking about all of these other things. And I think finally, really setting it, and this is a point that I think Ryan touched on, you touched on it too, setting appropriate expectations. What do we really think? What do we expect to learn from this? Because these are, if you're talking about research, it's an experiment. And so setting the appropriate expectations for what may or may not happen. And it could be, we all talk about the therapeutic misconception, but really finding out what the family hopes to get from this. And I've been surprised, both ways, where families say, we just want to make sure that this doesn't happen to another family the way that this happened to us. And it's, very much on the altruistic side of the spectrum. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, we want to help other people, but quite frankly, we're hoping that we get the active arm instead of the placebo arm, or we get the on period instead of the off period first. And, there's a reason why a well-designed research study is going to hopefully put forth the thought of equipoise and really put that front and center, that we don't know what's going to happen. We think there's a reasonably good chance that this is going to work the way we think it is, because that's why we're proposing it. But there are no guarantees in this. And hopefully by addressing those expectations, and sometimes you need to do this multiple times too. It's not, again, this isn't the quick, 10-minute discussion, hey, come on in, we'll get your gene therapy and you're good to go by the end of the day. It's, making sure you know what they're reading. So, there are a lot of good things out there. And, Dr. Google can be a friend. Dr. Google can also be Dr. Google can be a frenemy too. So, and bringing, if you have questions about what you read online, if it seems scary, It may or may not be accurate. Come back and talk to me about it. And then let's sort of provide, I think the one thing I can do as a physician is help to provide some context. That is where my education hopefully pays off. I can't tell what's right for one patient may not be right for another patient. So I can't tell them what to do. Although, as Ryan said, people do come to us asking for our professional expertise. So, but what sets me apart from Dr. Google is I can contextualize something better than Dr. Google can.
We're very confident that you can.
I hope.
Safiyya, Ryan, Adam, they've kind of walked us through some really nice best practices and tools that various stakeholders can be thinking about. When we think about policymakers and payers, what policies might support best practices? If you could just maybe comment a little bit there. Thanks.
Sure. So I think from a regulatory perspective, just going back to the comments Ryan made around patient preference data, I would just emphasize the importance of patient experience data that should inform regulatory decision making. We were pleased to see in the recent Cures 2.0 bill that was released a couple of weeks ago, there were some provisions related to the use of real world evidence as well as patient experience data within regulatory decision making. And I think this is a promising start. From an access perspective, dealing with some of the uncertainties and dearth of data available at launch, I think we need to think about new ways to measure value or quality of life that take into consideration broader elements. So things like lifetime burden of disease, disease severity, as well as wider elements of value, things like caregiver perspective, societal perspective, as I mentioned earlier. Now, we know at launch we won't have all this data, and we know that there are questions from payers around how long these treatments will last. So we at Pfizer are exploring new ways to finance these therapies that will spread payment over time and move to real world outcomes, and the hope there is that will address some of the questions around durability. However, in order to enter into these types of novel payment models, there are some policy barriers that are still in place. In the US, from a Medicaid perspective, we still need the final implementation of the CMS DBP rule. There are states that still need state plan amendments to allow them to enter into these types of agreements. So it's an evolving environment, it's dynamic, and we've seen some progress over the past couple of years through some of the initiatives like 21st Century Cures, but I think there's still some work that needs to be done from a policy perspective to ensure that these therapies can come to market.
Thanks, Safiyya. And, Cláudia, I'm going to come back to you. Again, we're on the theme of tools and best practices, and what can public and private sponsors of pediatric gene therapy research be doing, right, to better communicate or to certainly, mitigate some of the uncertainty in order to empower and provide really a shared understanding of benefit and risk in light of uncertainty?
Thank you. In short, education and connection, co-developing with patient groups who are always the real experts in the condition. But education should be viewed very broadly. I feel that a family and even a child, by the way, don't leave the kids out of this whole conversation. Always think about how we communicate to them. They have a right to understand at an age appropriate level what's happening. But thinking of the communications in such a way where they include, for example, the regulatory process. They shouldn't have to learn all the steps one by one. There is no reason for that. You can certainly put the caveats of multiple things could happen here, and you can have some examples of things that might happen, explaining what are decisions that would come from those and explaining some decisions that could happen. If you're doing anything innovative, it's never a path that has been traveled before, right? It's new, and there will be all these elements of uncertainty, but you can at least explain who needs to know what at what point, who is in charge of what decision, what those decisions might look like, and how do they as families can participate or understand or at least get the information at which point. So just one example of the different aspects of education that need to take place. We talked about the scientific one. We talked about the communication policies of different companies, why certain things need to be disclosed a certain way. And by the way, there are ways to connect with patient groups, even as a public company, so they have, you know, advance notice when something material is coming out, so that they can prepare for those communications. So just the broader set of education. The other thing that comes up, we did a roundtable of companies, of patients with multiple gene therapies. Some had participated, some were considering participating in different therapeutic areas. One thing that was extremely consistent, this is something that Adam touched on, was the need for education on the process, exactly where they needed to be, when, how many times, there was a lot that came up for those who participated that was unexpected and created significant burden for the families. So all these different aspects of education should be thought ahead of time, and it's my main plug is developed with the real experts, which are always going to be the patient groups.
Thanks, Cláudia. You know, and maybe this is a little controversial, but how do we shout out, you know, really great practices? I think we're good at that, right? You know, in bringing, when companies bring patients in to help with the protocol development, or to, you know, kind of get that expertise that lends so much value to the process, right? We're good at kind of acknowledging that we do that, okay? You know, but how should we be communicating these great practices by sponsors or by trial sites or CROs or regulatory agencies? But also, how do we maybe draw attention to less than ideal practices so that they don't continue? Maybe that's language, maybe that's behavior, I don't know. But, you know, how might we do that?
I think it's always going to be very difficult to consider the position of companies or investigators in calling attention to that. So I'm afraid it falls again to the patient groups. It is, in my opinion, within their remit to maybe not say when something is bad, but say when something needs to be improved, and to certainly give a shout out, as you say, to things that have worked really well. They are typically skilled in, companies or sponsors want to work with what has been done well and what could be improved directly to those stakeholders or that level of information. Even because if the patient groups don't take on that role, they will unfortunately have to deal with the consequences of the poor communication, because it will come back to them when the patients feel that something didn't work or something was not clear or was miscommunicated. They will cry on the shoulders of the patient groups every time. So it does behoove them to have a role in advocating for things that work well and for things that need to be improved.
Thanks, Cláudia. And this is the last question to the panelists that I will pose, right? And then we would like to invite questions from the participants here for our panelists. So please, if you haven't already, submit them through the Q&A, and we'll continue to converse around the issues that you raise. But to Ryan, Adam, Cláudia, and Safiyya, last question, make your answer brief. What is the support that's needed by advocacy, researchers, clinicians, and industry to guide their communications? What do they need in order to do this better? Ryan.
So, I mean, I think there's a couple things. I think some of this has been touched on. We recognize that we all live in this drug development ecosystem, and we all have sort of different needs, perspectives, and information that I think we need to do more of that convening, and patient groups are natural conveners of these various stakeholders. I think that when that's done, we have seen that translate into better ways of communication getting out there. If we're all continuing to work in silos and not understand how each other is communicating to a given patient, a stakeholder community, then I think that's where we get mixed messages and patients are confused about these emerging therapies. I hope that answered the question in some way. Being first is never fun.
I know. Adam.
So let me build a little bit on Ryan. I'm gonna sort of take the baton, run with a little bit more. I think getting some sort of a 360 perspective on it is really important. I think patient advocacy groups are great conveners, like he said. I think you need to agree on what the main points are, how those main points are going to overlap at different steps in the process. You don't certainly want to have conflicting information. You need to have consistent information. And then finally agreeing on who's going to communicate each part of that message or those messages, and how to indicate where there are areas of uncertainty and what's being done to address that uncertainty. I think when people throw their hands up and say, yeah, I don't know, that's not a satisfying answer. Saying we don't know, but there's a study that we're now doing to try to explore that question is, at least, get off your tail and do something about it.
There we go. Okay, Cláudia.
I think, we talked about understanding the community that you're serving, but I would also add making sure that patients themselves in a patient engagement capacity and patient groups are involved in decision-making, that their participation is early enough and meaningful enough that actually has an opportunity to have an impact. Then developing a communication strategy collaboratively, understanding those needs, and executing a communication strategy flawlessly. Just really, it's not about what you know. That can have limitations, but you can still talk about all those things around it. So a lot of education. And lastly, to tie into what Adam said, now we're definitely going on in sequence, assess your success or your challenges. Conduct proper independent surveys of how things are working. Don't be afraid to look at where you stand. There's always opportunity to get better.
Thanks, Cláudia. Safiyya. Again, last but certainly not least.
So I think the first is collaboration. I think across our stakeholder community, we see the same sets of questions coming out. And I think from an industry perspective, it's better to work together than working alone. So I would say collaboration is the first. I think the second is around terminology, or ensuring that we are talking in the same way around these treatments. So making sure we have consistent terminology across so we can manage expectations and communicate appropriately.
And Katherine, I'm sorry, I'm breaking the rules, but I just wanted to add in, and we touched on some of these things, but having patient groups review informed consents so that they are patient friendly and understandable. Presentations, we often ripped presentations apart for the language used in some of these talks. And it was mentioned before the investor community. A forward-looking statement means something different to an investor versus a patient. And while those are flashed on a screen, I think we need to understand the weight of them on a patient community versus an investor community.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, so I'm going to start to take some of the questions from our Q&A through Zoom. And many of you have touched on these themes, but I'm going to ask some of these questions directly. We've referenced informed consent, right, and that process. What does, and I think, Ryan, this question, I'm going to ask you first. What does involving patients in the informed consent process look like?
Well, it definitely has to be a process and not a sort of, limited period of interaction and a pile of papers. I know that it was mentioned, I think Adam saying that even having some institutions have a patient advocate there to really address, health literacy, things of that nature. I think there's a pre-informed consent that should be happening. with a conversation of the understandings of the clinical trial process and even basic vocabulary around the words used in informed consent. It has to be ongoing so that every visit there is a continued conversation around the study and what they understand. And I think that physicians have a responsibility to really look for certain signals in their interactions with those families. And if something seems off, and I'll give you an example of a mom who went into the first dosing of gene therapy, went to the institution and was saying out loud, "Today is magic medicine day. My son's finally going to be cured." That should be a signal that the process has failed. So I think all of those things we need to examine. And again, I'm often surprised at patient groups don't have access to looking at informed consent documents and commenting on them. I said this at a meeting recently, and the company said, "I swear we sent it to you." I said, "No, I would have remembered reading an informed consent document about this trial." So, I mean, lean on us. That's what, I think that we could help make it more patient-centric, but we also could work with our clinical community on it as well and understand from institution to institution what are best practices and what's working. And finally, I think for all of this, we need to talk to the patients after they've been dosed and gone through the entire process and get data on their experience, because I think this informs everything we're talking about. What they viewed to be uncertainty, how that impacted their decision-making, how did they feel afterwards? Because then it will help inform what we do moving forward.
Thanks, Ryan. Adam, I know this is a topic for you as well. What does, at the point of care, you're obviously involving patients because they're in the conversation, but I think you had some really good ideas about how to maybe improve that informed consent process. So what does involving patients in the informed consent process look like to you?
Yeah, well, let me build on something first that Ryan just said, and that is I can't think of any major investment that I have made where I'm talking about things like, a car or an appliance or something like that, where I didn't go back and look at the reviews beforehand about someone's post-experience reviews, what they thought of it. Why wouldn't you do exactly the same thing for something that arguably is more important than my washer and my dryer, right? I mean, you need to know. And so I know we've made reference to lived experience groups. That's really, really important. And I think that having that as a part of the informed consent process is really important too. I think that, there are interactions when we talk about informed consent. There are interactions with the IRBs, which are really important. I think, IRBs are supposed to have community members serving on them. And sometimes those community members do a really good job. And sometimes, they could provide more input than they do. We have the single IRB for NIH funded studies. That's really important. Another group that we have not discussed is actually we're talking about the tech transfer folks who might actually also have an important perspective on how that informed consent goes through. And so I think that, we've talked about, I think all the other points that I have made, Ryan made very well, so I don't want to reiterate them, but it has to be, it's the mantra, right? It has to be truly informed and it has to be consent. And it's a process, and it's, I'm not going to beat that one too much, but it really understand, I think, again, a 360 assessment of what's going into that document is really important. And then figuring out how that's going to be. I mean, we talk about reconsenting people for extension studies. We should probably have a reconsenting process involved too. Now, granted, someone has already been administered the treatment, so to speak, but figuring out a clever way to there may be in the future ways of turning these things on and off under more control than we have right now. If we're talking about gene therapy, it's not just you just sort of stick it in and it goes. I mean, that's sort of the way it goes now. But if we have ways to control the promoters for some of these genes or for some of these treatments, genetic treatments, then perhaps reconsent is really a critical part of that too.
Interesting. And so, Cláudia, if we just stay on the informed consent and I make it a little bit more specific, what can, if any, what can companies be doing to involve patients in the informed consent process? Maybe you're, as a consultant to some of these companies, maybe you're aware of best practices, but what does involving patients in the informed consent process look like from the perspective of a company?
I think companies have every intention of making it informative, but that's just not good enough. As Ryan mentioned, this has to be a process. And as I said before, you really need to put patients and patient groups, and I speak of those as two separate groups on purpose, in the heart of decision making. So that involvement needs to happen before you have a final draft, and you're basically sending it to them as a courtesy or claiming that you send, right? They really need to be on the ground on developing it. And I really like the idea of testing, which is something that no one really talks about, but going through the consent and actually testing that family on what they learned. Not just, at the beginning, but also in the middle of the trial and certainly at the end. I think families would appreciate a dialogue that it's not like the SATs, but it's just saying, okay, we need to understand what parts of this were clear for you and what parts we need to expand on. Can I ask you a few questions? And then just have an assessment of what's working and adjust accordingly. So I think that would be really helpful.
Great, thanks, Cláudia. Okay, shifting away from informed consent, I'm really interested in this next question, okay? When you are thinking about communicating this uncertainty with patients, okay, does available information that you include really stick to the data that comes from the trials, or is data coming from somewhere else? And I think when we were, kind of getting ready for this, we talked about this idea that maybe there's knowledge transfer, from one study in a therapeutic area to another. So is there data that comes from real world sources that become part of this conversation, or does it really stick to the trial where there may be in early days lack of information to answer some of these questions? So, maybe Cláudia, I'll start with you.
And I'd love to hear what Adam has to say on this, but I think that depends a lot in one aspect of whether the patients are seeing their treating physicians or if they're seeing a physician just for the purpose of the trial. Because if they're seeing their treating physicians, they're having a broad dialogue at every point of contact. They're talking about that patient's overall perspective and what issues may or may not be important to that patient. If you're going to investigator for the purpose of the trial and don't have that broad relationship, I think they'll still talk to you about all the different points that they want to know about you and understand you. But I view that discussion is usually more limited. We actually hear from, in research that we've done, that conversation can be very limited. So I think expanding on that may be helpful in terms of all the different perspectives that can be relevant for that patient, within reason, of course, because the focus is going to be on the trial. Hope that helps.
Adam?
So tough one. So I think I break it down into three categories. So let's start with what's the information that's available. The first is what we know from the studies. The second is what we may be extrapolating from another similar, what we think might be a similar thing. And then the third falls into the category of anecdote, but I don't want that to have a pejorative flavor to it, because sometimes the word anecdote does have a pejorative flavor, but I sort of put in the category of case reports. And so I think it depends a little bit on who's communicating it. I think that you clearly do have to, I think as a treating clinician, I had to communicate what we know came from the studies. So this gets us into the known knowns and a little bit of the known unknowns. There also can be the opportunity, like I said, to extrapolate. And I think it's very important to label each of these. And again, this is where the clinician can provide some context. So this is what we know from the study. This is what we are extrapolating from other studies. And I've had patients say, and this has not been validated in a randomized double-blind controlled trial, however you want to, frame that. But I've also heard this. Now, sometimes I've also heard this later comes back. I've seen this happen with some of our seizure medicines, where we'll hear something anecdotally, and then all of a sudden it shows up in a case series or in another study a year or two down the road. So you don't want to necessarily ignore that. And if someone's bringing it up in a conversation, they've heard it from somewhere. Sometimes you have to ask, where did you hear that from? Well, someone else had a different kind of a treatment for a different disease, but I heard that might be an issue. So again, it's framing it, contextualizing it. So I sort of break it down into those three categories: what we know from the study, what we extrapolate, and then what we've heard, by word of mouth. Again, not poo-pooing that, but also understanding from a scientific perspective how to calibrate each of those.
Thanks, Adam. And I'm actually going to ask Safiyya this question as well, because, I would imagine when talking with, policymakers and payers, right, they may not be looking at, a specific trial or a specific community, right? They're looking at broader picture, decisions for investigational gene therapy products. And so to what extent are, other data sources used in those conversations, Safiyya?
Yeah, no, Katherine, I think it's a really great point. And I think Project Hercules, which is really trying to do that, incorporating different measures beyond sort of the traditional clinical trial data, is a great example of how this is happening in practice, and bringing patient perspective around quality of life, but then also caregiver perspective, things that wouldn't be incorporated within a clinical trial data package that's given to payers. So I think those are examples of ways we are trying to go about communicating some of this data to our policymaker and payer community, but using wider measures of value that are important to the patient community.
Thanks, Safiyya. Now, I don't know. I see, Ryan, are you back? There's a question in the chat around patient preference data, and I think this is a really good one, and I'm so thankful for the question. If patient preference data is so important, how do we get it, right? Recognizing that there are certainly communities that may be a little bit more advanced in data and advocacy groups who are more proficient in doing this work. Is it just patient advocacy groups that's collecting it, or does the NIH or other groups fund collecting this data? And so, Adam, I'm gonna ask you that question from an NIH perspective. Are you aware of patient preference data or research being done within the National Institute of Health?
So, yeah, so obviously we can only respond to what applications come into us, but certainly, you'll notice that increasingly in our funding announcements, we're actually strongly recommending, and that's like a big hint, strongly recommending that patient advocacy groups are involved from the very beginning, from the design stage and the conceptual stage, not just getting a letter of support, oh yeah, we support this study. And I think when you have that, you start to think about, we have, FDA has its patient-focused development program, and I think that trying to figure out what's important is critical from a patient perspective. And sometimes you'll see, I've seen this happen a couple of times now, where midstream there's a concern that comes up that's patient-driven. And so that's an issue if it's a study that has safety monitoring. Well, they all have some level of safety monitoring, but typically if they have a study monitoring committee or a data safety monitoring board, that's something that can be raised up, and you can say, all right, well, we need to start collecting those data. So there's certainly nothing that prevents it, and I'd say we encourage it, but there are an awful lot of data that come out of these. Most of our large studies that we fund at NINDS, we actually just had a study that getting ready to close out, and it was not in this space. It was in a different disease space, but they just closed the study and they've already got 25 manuscripts that are ready to go. So there's a ton of information. Part of what we haven't discussed today is data sharing and how that whole thing looks, because that's critical. That is something we're starting to write into our funding announcements, and it's something that's very important across, I think, all the federal agencies, but I can only speak for NIH and NINDS. So data sharing is extremely critical, and we do see patient focus groups come back to ask to look at some of those data for a whole variety of reasons. So yes, really important, but it's expensive. So we have to know if we can anticipate it ahead of time, then it goes into the budget, and it's a heck of a lot easier to do rather than asking to come back for money later on saying, oh, we want to set this thing up. It always does better. And we haven't talked at all, I don't think we really needed to, but talking about the integrity of the data, which is something where when you have missing data and that sort of thing, we sent you this questionnaire, we really need you to fill out this questionnaire, because if you have missing data, then a lot of this stuff sort of goes out the window. Not out the window, but it lessens its potential impact.
Thanks, Adam. And Cláudia, I'm going to ask for your input here in thinking about, where might resources be available to guide patient advocacy groups and patient communities about conducting patient preference research. When we think, is that perhaps an area of opportunity to collaborate with companies? Is that something that patient communities could be working with companies on? Are there, is this something that maybe you potty, or that there are forums out there for communities to upskill themselves in how to conduct patient preference research?
I'm aware of some groups in Europe that can offer some support, UPATA being one of them, but then you have some cultural differences to account for. I think it behooves the patient group to collaborate with industry, because you really want to make sure that you're addressing questions that are going to be important to them. And again, making determinations that impact decision-making, right? Which I think is always the ultimate goal. So since they are the ones who may benefit in a practical sense in the shortest period of time, I think it makes sense to have that partnership be the case. And of course, looking at what other groups have done and considered that they have done it successfully, they're pleased with the process, and learning from those experiences, which again, your industry partners may know. We can certainly offer specific examples in specific areas, and it's very, very different in terms of approach as well. In some areas, you have one patient group that really encompasses a whole population. Others are very fragmented, and you need to go about it in a very different way. But we can certainly advise on that as well. But I think partnering, in terms of it's the best interest of both the patient group and the pharma company or biotech.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. There's so many coming in. I don't know how to pick, and we may be jumping around a little bit, but I think this is something that is unique to rare diseases. That for rare diseases, the number of patients available for natural history studies and clinical trials are limited. Having a smaller number of patients also increases the burden on each patient for participating in a study or a trial. How can you deal with this when there are competing gene therapies developed by companies, and patients have to decide which one to choose? And I think, Ryan, this is probably something near and dear to your community, given that you are in a very privileged position in the Duchenne community to have multiple studies undergoing gene therapy approaches.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, I think that families are constantly going through the if-then scenarios in their head. If I choose this, then this could happen. And what if I make the wrong choice? it's being as informed as possible and asking as many questions to those who are in our ecosystem, whether those are clinicians, the companies themselves, patient advocacy. You just want to be able to make the most informed choice as possible. And if there's pieces of information that you feel are missing to make that choice, then we need to think about that and think about how are we going to be able to better articulate or provide information. I think the unknowns is what people really grapple with, is making a choice with so much uncertainty just doesn't feel good. And when it's a one-time treatment, I think that the pressure is even higher. I think that the companies are putting out information regarding what they're seeing in these early stage trials. I worry about the language around what they're reporting in terms of adverse events. Complement activation doesn't sound like something that's terribly bad when it has complement in the name, but I think that patients need to understand what those adverse events are and what they mean so they can make a more informed choice based on what's out in the public.
And I think that's pretty challenging to do if maybe we're all dealing with the same degree of uncertainty, but we're choosing to talk about it differently, right? How does that impact decisions by families? Okay, we're coming to the half hour, but I do want to ask another question that's been raised. I think human nature, we're uncomfortable in uncertainty, and we may seek to mitigate uncertainty. And I think, Ryan, you have brought up the issue of neutralizing antibodies, right? Maybe you could reflect in your words, and Adam, you could reflect in yours, in what ways might families be seeking to mitigate uncertainty so that they, kind of see a path forward for their decisions? Ryan, why don't you start? And, what are some of the implications of these actions, right? Maybe anticipated outcomes, who knows?
Yeah, we have seen families getting testing done that are outside of the trial to give them some sort of sense of whether or not they could qualify for a trial, but the companies have been really consistent about communicating that does not translate to meaning you could be eligible for a study based on that test. That's not the test we're running. And then there's the choice, the chance that you may develop those antibodies in between getting the test and then actually being screened. I think it's hard to mitigate uncertainty. What I struggle with is the fact that we don't have sort of this central lab that could test patients' blood across the studies to give them a sense of whether or not they could qualify, leaves them with limited options unless they actually get into the trial to screen. And that doesn't feel very good, because then they may not make a choice to get on one of our approved therapies. They may not join another trial, and they may be waiting. We've heard of parents putting their children, isolating them in a bubble out of fear that will then cause them to develop antibodies and then not be able to participate. So we're just trying to educate folks on what we know, what's myth versus what's fact, and what is still evolving.
And Adam, what are some of the ways that you might be seeing families trying to mitigate some of these uncertainties? Ryan just referenced, isolating themselves to protect against exposure to virus. What are you seeing? What are families bringing to you as possible actions?
Yeah, I think there's really a couple of answers to that. One is that I think that we have families who are going out for all sorts of labs, testing, and even other types of treatments, and making sure that those don't interfere with the approved protocols or the data monitoring. And so I know that that's an ongoing issue. But I want to and they may get other professionals. They may get allopathic physicians involved in some of these treatments. I certainly have, a number of patients who are seeking treatments from a whole variety of healers and providers. But I think, let's put, something I like to tell my residents and fellows, it's about the patient, not about you. And so, and that's quote goes back probably from even before the book, The House of God, for those of you who are familiar with it. Let's put this in perspective, especially for the rare diseases. They're not, the people who are living with these diseases are not that different than people like astronauts who are talk about the uncertainty and the unknown. And we certainly hold that group of people up as being heroes, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be holding this group up as heroes as well. And I think as time goes on, I think that it's harder. The initial ones have a lot more uncertainty that they're dealing with than people who are coming in later, because we're learning something. Again, it's that extrapolation of knowledge. I think arranging for support for the families and their decision-making and coping is absolutely critical. I think that there are a variety of professionals who can provide that kind of support. That, to me, that's probably the only magic bullet that I think that I have in my pocket. And it's very, very hard to find that kind of support. But making sure, Ryan told that story about the parent who, had their cure day, and that's, you see that and you're kind of thinking, where did we not do something, or, and I think that addressing it along the way and the open dialogue and having supports are really, I think, the keys to managing some of that uncertainty, and acknowledging what a tough job it is to be the parent or the person who is faced with this decision. I mean, my goodness gracious. So to say that they're like the astronauts, I don't think is being too hyperbolic.
All right, thanks, Adam. And this is going to be the last question. And I think for whomever submitted it, it's more of a statement than a question, but I think it's important to highlight, what I think is being kind of maybe referenced here is the idea of equity in terms of involving the patient community in some of the skilled conversations that we're talking about, right? And the attendee is saying, okay, it's important to acknowledge the difference between professional patient advocates and organizations versus, everyday patients who are often left out of these conversations, right? And I think we need to recognize that any patient community is certainly not homogeneous with regard to attitudes, behaviors, background, etc. So I'm going to kind of tie this into a question to Cláudia. The attendee says a highly educated family is super helpful, but not often representative of the range of experiences with regard to health literacy, access, etc. How do we become more inclusive, right, in our conversations to reach all folks who may want the opportunity or want access to the information?
Thank you. I think the difference between patient engagement, engaging with the individual, which is extremely important and valid, is completely different than patient advocacy, engaging with the patient groups. They're different, but they are interdependent, and it's very important to have both. Companies need to reach the potential entire population that they could possibly benefit. So to do that, they need to harp on this, understand that community. Some communities have larger connections than others, but a lot of communities, even when the patient groups are extremely active and have a lot of participation, still don't connect necessarily at the regional level, at the very local level. So understanding how those relationships take place is important. Most of our clients have a patient engagement function as well, for which we recruit participation of exactly patients who are more removed, and we look specifically also for different levels of information. The patient who understands it and the patient who's never heard about the concept. So to put it shortly, absolutely, you need to take both into consideration.
Thank you, Cláudia. And that's a perfect way to end the discussion. Thank you to all the panelists. We're out of time. Thank you for the great discussion. And thank you to all of the attendees for your participation, your thoughtful questions. Be sure to tune in for tomorrow's panel, Trust and Transparency for Trial Participants and Families. If you aren't registered, it isn't too late to do so. And on behalf of PGTME, I would like to thank all of you who have attended, participated, or helped put this event together. And I hope that you have a great, wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Katherine, for moderating. Take care.
Thank
everyone.
you.